Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, a scally-dandling about the books, and today was the last day of our October 2022 group read, the Mayor of Casterbridge, or the last scheduled reading day for the group read. And I don't know how many of you out there have picked up the Mayor of Casterbridge this October because of the group read, but I do know that about 45 of us have been talking about it in the Goodreads discussion group for the group read, and I thought it would be nice to kind of wrap up a little about the book with a bit of a review and pick up on some of the things that have been talked about in the Goodreads discussion. Now, I just need to say that here in Sussex, we're having a bit of a wild weather evening. There's thunder, lightning and rain in the background. So if you hear some strange noises off, that's what it is. I hope it won't be a problem. I don't think so. Now, let's talk about the Mayor of Casterbridge. So, it's a novel that was published by Thomas Hardy in 1886. It came out initially as a weekly serialisation, and then May of 1886 wrapped together as a single book. In many ways, I think it's about the 10th novel that he wrote, but in many ways it's a kind of archetypal Hardy novel, because it's set in the southwest of England that he loved so much, Hardy's Wessex, as he came to kind of call it, and as we call it still. I mean, he didn't call it Hardy's Wessex, he called it Wessex, and we call it, you know what I mean. It's a realist novel, which was his sort of usual style, I guess. It's really embedded in rural and small town life, and which was his sort of favourite setting, I guess. And it has a strong plot that takes some very human characters with kind of complex, flawed personalities, and shows how the combination of those personalities and their interactions, but also their interaction with fate and the constraints of Victorian social conventions and sort of the economic sort of limitations of their lives, how those things all come together to shape their lives and their experiences and their relationships and their behaviour, and that's your sort of classic Hardy model for a novel, I guess. He was in his mid-40s when he wrote this book. So, because Hardy was born in 1840, and he was born in I was going to say a small village, more like a hamlet, really, in the county of Dorset, in southwest Wessex. It's just about 3 or 4 miles from the town of Dorchester, but kind of a really sort of rural setting is his childhood home, and it's a sort of 3-bedroom cottage. It's nothing grand. His father was a stonemason, bricklayer, sort of small-time builder in the local area. His mother had been in service, worked as a servant. Interestingly, she seems to have kind of really enjoyed her working life and been quite ambitious within it. She went into service age 13, but by her 20s she'd worked her way up to being a cook, which was a kind of one of the sort of the most important servants in a household, and was working for sort of quite smart families in London, whatever. And she seems to have been quite thwarted, actually, by the fact that she fell pregnant with Thomas Hardy, and as a result, effectively had to marry Hardy's father, also Thomas Hardy. So, and found herself then sort of stuck in this little village in what she probably saw as the middle of nowhere. She was a reader, and she seems to have been the one who pushed for young Thomas to get a decent education. And the fact that he stayed on at school to the age of 16 was quite exceptional for someone of his background, I would say. However, he leaves school at 16. He was obviously a bright boy. He was apprenticed to a architect. So where his father was sort of like a builder, bricklayer, stonemason, you know, it was a step up to become a sort of a stonemason architect. And that was locally, but eventually he moved to London to kind of further his career as an architect and train more. But at the same time, he starts to write, and after about 5 years in London, he's hoping that he might make his career as a writer. So he moves back to the West Country, and he works part-time as an architect or architect's assistant, and throws himself into writing, and succeeds. Ultimately, and succeeds in becoming, you know, a kind of prosperous, successful, well thought of writer, a man who could, you know, live a comfortable life, go to London in the season, mix with the literary elite of his day. But he was, you know, when he writes about the rural poor, agricultural labourers, small craftsmen, you know, business people of a provincial town, you know, those are the people that he grew up with. Those are the people that he knew. You know, that's it's not, you know, there's no fantasy about that. That's all very was real for him. And you really get a strong sense of that in The Mayor of Casterbridge. You know, this is a book where the central character is seen as a financial and business success, because he goes from being an itinerant, semi-skilled labourer, a hay trusser, you know, one of those disappeared professions, I guess, to being the biggest corn merchant in this small market town, and hence gets to be mayor. So one of the pleasures of the book, and this is certainly something that the people in the Goodreads group picked up on, was that range of characters in the story, and in particular the minor characters, the labourers, the ne'er-do-wells, and the hardworking ones. And one of the group, who was it? Ian, perhaps, he remarks on how Hardy uses those characters to reserve the central action and comment on it, and sometimes sort of get stuck in ways that might be mischievous or yeah. It brings some light relief and a sort of an affectionate quality at times to the book. I'm going to give you an example here of a sort of poor old woman, I suppose you'd call her, a Mother Coxham, who is talking about Michael Henchard's wife after she dies, and how she describes her. And all her shining keys will be took from her, and her cupboards opened, and things I didn't wish seen anybody will see, and her little wishes and ways will be as nothing. What a lovely way to talk about someone after an elegy almost for a housewife for whom, you know, those things were important to her, and that's what's lost when she's gone. I think this is a typical Hardy novel in the sense that it's you need a bit of light relief because it is quite a sad story. But another aspect of the book that kind of stops it from being, I don't know, too depressing, you know, unremittingly sort of, I don't know, melodramatic or miserable, is Hardy's really intense love for nature and the local landscape and local history, and that really pervades the book. And again, this was something that lots of the group readers picked up on. He although he was writing in the 1880s, the book is set about 40 years earlier. So it's really set in the time of his childhood, and there's a kind of a nostalgic quality, I suppose, to some of the description. It's also interesting to think about the fact that Hardy thought of himself as a poet first. You know, that was his most important writing, in a sense, was his poetry. And some of that, I think, you see in the quality of his language, in his descriptions and so on, as a novelist. I think one of the group, Gabrielle, picked out this particular passage, which I'll read for you. Okay, he's describing how close the town of Casterbridge, which was based on his hometown of Dorchester, is to the countryside. And he says, bees and butterflies in the cornfields at the top of the town, who desired to get to the meads at the bottom, took no circuitous course, but flew straight down the high street without any apparent consciousness that they were traversing strange latitudes. And in autumn, airy spheres of thistledown floated into the same street, lodged upon the shop fronts, blew into drains, and innumerable tawny and yellow leaves skimmed along the pavement and stole through people's doorways into their passages with a hesitating scratch on the floor, like the skirts of timid visitors. Yeah, we all, I think, really enjoyed that sort of quality in the writing. But there is no getting away from the fact that this book is a tragedy. You know, I don't know, there's hints of, I don't know, King Lear, you know, that kind of tragic force about the book. Again, this was something that the group readers picked up on. I think it was Froggles that talked about that feeling of foreboding that she experienced as she was reading the book. One of the ways that Hardy achieves that powerful kind of sort of dynamic quality to the tragedy is setting it in a very close and limited location physically. So, you know, characters in the book go further afield, but we don't go with them. All the action takes place in Casterbridge or close to it. You know, it's that adds, I suppose, to the intensity and a feeling of like not being able to get away from your fate or the consequences of your actions. Casterbridge is absolutely recognisable as Dorchester, where the town near where he grew up and the town that he comes back to once he's a successful writer. At the time he was writing The Mayor of Casterbridge, he actually had designed himself a house that he was having built. In fact, I think his brother was building it for him in Dorchester, and that was where he was going to live for the rest of his life. He draws on the fact that Dorchester is a very historic town. You know, and bits of that sort of add to the atmosphere of the action. You know, things happen in a Neolithic site that's on the edges of the town, and the fact that, you know, it was a Roman town and it's got a sort of Roman layout. You know, he builds that into the novel in a way that I think lots of us found intriguing and appealing. But it also, as I say, it means that his cast of characters are kind of really can't avoid each other. You know, they're pushed close together. Now, I said there's quite a big cast of minor characters that we sort of touch upon, but the actual central plot revolves around just a very few people, and really it all revolves around the one central character, Michael Henchard, the Mayor of Casterbridge. He's the linchpin of the entire story, and what a character he is. And that's certainly something that really came out in our Goodreads discussion group, because, you know, people just kept circling back to what did we think of Michael Henchard. He's an energetic man, a hard-working man, a self-made man in many ways. He has a kind of strong native wit, but he's uneducated, and he's not clever with figures. You know, he's not. Yeah, he relies really on sort of hard work and energy to get where he does. He's a really bad-tempered person. No getting away from that. And with that, there's a kind of an impulsiveness and I don't know, a sort of depressive quality too, that he's quite clumsy in his personal relationships, and all those things come together to create a kind of a self-destructiveness, which is at the heart of the tragedy of the story, I guess. Even though ultimately, he does usually take responsibility for his actions and try belatedly to put them right. And that was something that I think, as readers, we really, as I say, circled around in our thinking, because I think people were really torn, and I was too, between deploring Henchard and how he behaves, and feeling a kind of a sympathy for his self-destruction. The way he brings everything on himself is both frustrating and sad. I know. Christopher, I think it was, said that he got really frustrated by this repeating pattern that Henchard gets into, which goes, I'll quote him, in fact, Christopher, get angry, do stupid thing, repent at leisure, and try to put things right. And then, round the circle again. And, Janelle was saying how, he never actually learns to control his own temper. And that's, something quite unlikable. And yet, you have to admire, and Judy in the group said this, how Hardy can manages to make him a sympathetic character, for the reader, as she says, in spite of the terrible things he does, and there's a balance, I suppose, to the fact that, well, as Teresa pointed out, all the characters in the story have flaws or do make bad decisions at times. It's not only Henchard, and that's what it makes it, gives a kind of a richness, I suppose, to something that is a sort of a downward spiral of self-destruction for him himself. It's a very melodramatic plot, I would say, and again, that's something that lots of people in the group picked up on. It's full of dramatic incidents, I suppose. People talked about gasping out loud at some of the plot twists, and someone, who was it? Lana, maybe, remarked on comparing it with Tess, and how that's a dramatic story, but is ultimately very much character centered, and this feels a bit more, I don't know, plot driven rather than character driven. Notwithstanding what I've just said about the tragic character, and I think Hardy himself, his one criticism of this book, was two things he said about it. His criticism was that he packed too much incident into the story, probably related to that weekly serialization and wanting every week for something notable to happen and for people to be looking forward to getting to the next, buying the next week's copy, as it were. Although he also said that it was the only book he wrote where he found himself weeping as he wrote it for what happens to the characters. Interesting when you think of Jude the Obscure, if that didn't make him weep, but this did, well, that's interesting, isn't it? What that did for all of us, or many of us in the group read, was that we struggled terribly to stick to the agreed schedule, because the way the plot is written, you're just pulled on to read the next bit. You never want to stop after the 2 chapters a day. It's like, give me more. I've just got to find out what. That's a joy, isn't it, in a book? Something we all enjoy. And although Hardy criticised it for being almost having too much incident, I think that actually we for the most part enjoyed that strong melodramatic plot. And I think part of why it works is because although there's all these twists, they're all kind of believable. There's coincidences, and but nevertheless, in the context of the times and the people and their personalities, the plot is believable. And even, the most extraordinary elements, and one of which, of course, was, the opening setup, where Henchard sells his wife and daughter, auctions them off as a way of getting out of a marriage that was, going badly and was actually unhappy for both parties. I think, even that is based on an actual kind of custom that did happen at the time, as an informal way of getting a divorce, given that divorce wasn't something that was open to anyone other than the most rich and with great difficulty. So there's you don't, yes, we might have gasped at the plot twist, but you never think, oh, that would never have happened. You might think, oh, why did you do that, you stupid person? Or why, if only you... But it was never like, oh, that's just silly. Well, now let's round up. I thought that this was a wonderful book, and I last read it when I was in my teens, and it was a real joy to come back to it. I don't think it hasn't moved into sort of top place, I suppose, as my absolute favourite Hardy novel, but it is, just so much. Nevertheless, I think you can describe it as a masterpiece. It's classic, archetypal Hardy, and I warmly recommend it to anyone. And if you're worried that I've talked about it as a tragedy, I think it's worth saying perhaps then that it has a sort of a happy ending in the end. There's this tragic ending, but things kind of come together for a couple of the main characters. Although Hardy being Hardy, he makes the very last sort of sentence of the book is one of those main characters for whom things have turned out happily, expressing almost their disbelief that has happened and that's possible. I'm going to read it to you. Okay, so as she says, in being forced to class herself amongst the fortunate, she did not cease to wonder at the persistence of the unforeseen, when the one to whom such unbroken tranquillity had been accorded in the adult stage, as in, she gets a happy ending, was she whose youth had seemed to teach that happiness was but the occasional episode in a general drama of pain. That's Hardy all over. I hope if you read the group but weren't part of the Goodreads discussion, you'll take this opportunity to comment below and say how you experienced this book. And if you've read Mayor of Casterbridge previously, not as part of this Victober, do chip in. And if you've never read it, I hope this will inspire you to read it next Victober or before.